the Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am joined by a first-time guest to the show, Diarmaid MacCulloch. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for having me.
Well, we are here at Cadhay House in Devon in this wonderful Tudor manor house with Henry VIII looking over our shoulder.
Yes, what an astonishing survival this is. Getting a bit of the feel of the great lost gate of Whitehall Palace here with a checkerboard design, the flint, the stone.
Oh, similar to this. I didn't know that.
Same era.
Wow. Now I'm going to look at this in a whole new light. Thank you for telling me that. Well, we are here, of course, for Wolf Hall Weekend, which, to me is all about Thomas Cromwell. And you have written a fantastic book on Thomas. And of course, the first question that I have to ask is why? Why did you choose him as a topic of all the topics you could choose?
Well, I was coming up to retirement from a history career in Cambridge, Bristol, Oxford. And I thought, well, what's the book I ought to write at the end of this academic career? And Thomas Cromwell is the obvious person because I've been thinking about Thomas Cromwell since I was a postgraduate back in the 1970s, because my supervisor for my doctorate was the great Professor Sir Geoffrey Elton, whose life had been centred around representing Cromwell in a sympathetic way to a new audience. And of course, he talked about Cromwell. My work wasn't exactly on Thomas Cromwell, but it involved looking at his papers. And so from the 70s, for the next 30 years onwards, 40 years, I was intimately involved in the great manuscript collection which survives from Thomas Cromwell's private papers.
Wow. Okay, I have so many questions. And he is such a fascinating character from Tudor history. And I hate to use the word character because that makes it sound like it's a story and he was a real person. But what is your impression of who he was as a man? Was he the villain?
No, he wasn't a villain. He was a Tudor politician. In that sense, they're all villains. You can't survive without doing bad things in Tudor England. But he's much more than that. He's a man who does bad things because his master sort of created the atmosphere where good people do bad things. Right. Henry VIII, a great narcissist, a man of great charisma. And so Thomas Cromwell became the man for 10 years who directed the phenomenon that was Henry VIII as much as anyone could. And that meant taking charge of policies which Henry wanted and making the realities out of them, but also adding your own agendas. And in Thomas Cromwell's case, that meant tidiness. He loved tidying things up, but also to promote a religious revolution, which was not that of Henry VIII. It was something like the Protestant Reformations of Martin Luther, Heinrich Bullinger, Ulrich Zwingli in Central Europe. And that was part of his agenda. And it's part of why, in the end, he had to die at the hands of his master.
Oh, tell me more about that, because that's an interesting part of him that I think many people maybe don't understand, was that relationship with Henry and his views on religion. And then we bring Anne Boleyn into that, of course, as well. And you have those three people. I always had the impression that Henry VIII remained more Catholic than a reformist.
He did. His views are extremely confusing. They're a sort of jackdaw's nest of all sorts of things piled together, whatever appealed to him. And some of those things are pretty conservative, pretty traditionalist, Catholic, if you like. And some of them are ideas plucked from the Reformations happening over the other side of the water across the North Sea, particularly the bits which favoured monarchs being in charge of the church. And in the middle of this, you've got people who've really understood what the Protestant Reformation was about. And one of them was Thomas Cromwell. Another was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, chosen by Henry VIII for a completely different reason. And the reason was to get him out of his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, say it had never existed as Archbishop of Canterbury, and preside over the marriage of a new queen, Anne Boleyn, with whom Henry was at that stage passionately in love. So there are all sorts of motives here. It makes Henry very confusing. It makes his Reformation very confusing. But you also need to place Thomas Cromwell in it. And all the evidence is that Thomas Cromwell was passionately, quietly, discreetly concerned to make a reformation work in Henry's church.
Oh, wow. What a difficult job to do.
Yes, and precisely a job which Henry had given him, ironically enough. He gave him a new title, Vicegerent in Spirituals. Extraordinary title, never used before in the church, never used again. And what did it mean? Well, it meant having the powers under the king, which Cromwell's previous master, Thomas Wolsey, had had under the Pope. It's a special office created for a particular person, just as a one-off. And yet, Thomas Cromwell actually employed many of the people whom Cardinal Wolsey had employed in his office as Pope's representative. It's extraordinary continuity.
Wow.
But they're using it for different people.
Yeah.
A king instead of a pope, and they're also using it, in Thomas Cromwell's case, for his own religious agenda.
Wow. I guess I've never really looked at Thomas that closely when it came to the religion part of it. It was always what he did behind the scenes for the king and what he gave to other families. And one of the families I've been researching for a long time is the Seymours.
Yes.
And your book helped me see even more how much he was favoring them in ways. And obviously the marriage between his son and Elizabeth Seymour, in my mind, and maybe you would disagree, is a way for the Cromwell line to be closer to royalty.
Oh, completely. I mean, it is the beginning of a dynasty. Mm-hmm. He was planning a dynasty, a Cromwell dynasty, closely allied with the king's wife, the king's sister-in-law, who was the woman married to Gregory, and it would have worked. It could have worked if Gregory had not messed things up after the marriage by some appalling sexual scandal, the details of which we don't know, but there he was set up in this brand new palace, a former monastery in Sussex, with Elizabeth, the new wife, the king's sister-in-law. Yeah. Then there is this obscure sexual scandal, and Gregory had to be bundled out of Sussex very quickly.
I've never heard about this.
No, I discovered it when you're writing the biography, and you've got the clues in Cromwell's papers, but no one's put them together right. What you reconstruct is something which happened about November 1538. It unravelled in Sussex. I say it's a sexual scandal. What else could it have been? It's not about religion. And it absolutely infuriated the bishop of that area, the Bishop of Chichester, who wrote a most aggressive letter to Thomas Cromwell's nephew and sort of fixer, his personal fixer, Richard Cromwell, saying, I have seen the young man, by which he meant Gregory, and I have offered him this particular penance discreetly, with lots of things to be done beside it. So it's big, it's a penance for something serious. But the young man will not accept it. Now, I wonder, the bishop says, what my Lord Privy Seal, Cromwell, would say if he knew, let alone the king. So Gregory's done something really serious and won't say sorry.
Wow.
And so what happened, he's sent to another castle in Kent. And then, of course, the Cromwell's own career started going very badly wrong, and so we don't know how that would have developed either.
That's an amazing story. And I feel like now it's been so long since I read your book, sometimes you forget things, right, that you read. That's really interesting to learn about that. You know, Cromwell clearly favored the Seymours. What other families was he favoring at that time?
Another great aristocratic family called the Greys. The previous head Grey, so to speak, had been the Marquis of Dorset back in the 1520s, and he was Thomas Cromwell's first major employer, only for about a year, and then Cardinal Wolsey talent-picked Thomas Cromwell from the Marquis of Dorset, but already he'd established a very close relationship with the whole family, so that you'll find Lord John Grey in the late 1520s addressing my dearest friend, Thomas Cromwell. And that relationship carried on into the reign of Edward VI, by which time the Greys were one of the great Protestant families pushing the Reformation forward. I think it's Thomas Cromwell who pushed them in that direction. So Greys, Seymours, these are the beginnings of the Protestant aristocracy of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd be interested to know what you think Thomas Cromwell's biggest contribution to the Tudor dynasty was.
Ooh, there are so many, actually. My old supervisor talked about a Tudor revolution in government, which Thomas Cromwell created. He got the wrong one. He meant a rather boring transformation of bureaucracy. And that's not really important. He didn't quite understand what was going on. But there were other revolutions I think Professor Elton didn't bother talking about. One is the religious one. That's Cromwell's achievement, and a particular sort of Protestantism that he pushed England towards. It's the Protestantism of Switzerland, not Germany. It's the Protestantism not of Luther, but of the Swiss reformers in Zurich. And that's the beginning of two great Protestant families in the Reformation. One is Lutheranism, the other is this other thing, call it Reformed. Crudely, you might say Calvinism in the end.
Okay.
So that's a big thing. But also there is the union of Wales with England. Wales, before the 1530s, was a series of quite miscellaneous territories in relation to the crown. Cromwell turned them into, administratively, a bit of England. Created counties there with justices of the peace, just like England. And the next task was the other realm, Ireland. The Lordship of Ireland, which was a complete mess and was mixed up with territories which didn't actually pay allegiance to the King of England, Gaelic territories. And Cromwell's project for those was clearly the same as Wales. Turn them into counties, shires like England, turn the Gaelic chiefs into English nobility with local titles, the Earl of this, the Viscount of that. He didn't have enough time for that. And England actually never got it right, with consequences which we're still living with. So it worked in Wales, didn't work in Ireland, and both those achievements or results are Thomas Cromwell's.
Did he have an opinion on Scotland at all?
No. Now, it's very interesting. Looking at his papers and my notes from them, there is very little on Scotland. And I think that's because that was a matter of foreign policy. Scotland is a foreign country.
Oh, true.
And Henry VIII never gave Cromwell the freedom to act in foreign policy that he'd given Cardinal Wolsey. Why? Why is that? I suspect he thought Cromwell was just too humbly born to do the things that kings do, and that's foreign policy. So Scotland is just not on Cromwell's agenda. He's got one or two Scottish friends who became, in the end, Protestants. But that's about it. And it's a remarkable silence in the manuscripts once you notice it.
Interesting. I do wonder how he would have felt about the whole rough wooing.
I think he would have regarded it as a ridiculous mistake. It's not the way you should go around an item of foreign policy. It makes no sense. It's amazing that there were any friends of England in Scotland after that.
Right.
And yet they had a Protestant Reformation. I think that's the power of religion, which we've forgotten, that it made the Scots forget just how badly the English had behaved in the 1540s. That's not Cromwell, though. That's the next story.
Yeah, it is. It is. That's the part of the story that I think, when I look at the foreign governments, how they must have seen England at the time under Edward VI, especially with his uncles, both of his uncles, and everything that happened there. That must have just looked like a joke to them.
Well, yes, England was a bit of a joke country. It's on the edge of Europe. It's a second-rate power at best. Who are the big boys? It's the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the King of Poland. Those are the three big powers in Europe. And England is just over there somewhere. And the mark of that is that no one in Europe spoke English. Why would you bother? You could learn French, perhaps, German, perhaps, but Latin you'd certainly need. But no one spoke English. And the changes, interestingly, later in the 16th century, it's Shakespeare, it's the gradual emergence of England as a seaborne power. And so by the 18th century, a few foreigners are beginning to learn English, but it's slow. And I think the English forget just how marginal England was in the time of Henry VIII. Henry VIII forgot. He wanted to be one of the big boys. And that is one of the reasons that Cardinal Wolsey fell, that he spent so much of his time on wasteful, idiotic foreign policy schemes designed to make Henry VIII look big. And they never could, because he wasn't.
Mm-hmm. I have another religion question for you, because this to me is your expertise, right?
Yeah.
Edward VI.
Yeah.
Had he lived, how do you think England would have changed?
I think it would have become a much more radical Protestant country.
Really?
He was, certainly as a teenager, absolutely seized by the Protestant message in a quite extreme form. He hated the Pope. He wrote a 12-page essay in French saying that the Pope was Antichrist.
Oh.
We've got his essays. They're very interesting. He was very clever. And I think we missed our bullet, really, when he died as a teenager. He would have been a more tyrannical, cleverer version of Henry VIII.
Oh, you think so?
I think so. And instead we got the two half-sisters. Mary wasn't that bad, dutiful, brave. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth was something else again, the cleverest of all the Tudors, cleverest in a clever family. Yeah. And we got 45 years of her. And the beginnings of England becoming slightly something better, something more central.
Am I wrong in assuming that Elizabeth was a little bit more open-minded to religion?
Yes. No, you're not wrong. You're right. Yeah. You're absolutely right. But in a very narrow, open sense, if you see what I mean, well, I'll explain. She was a woman of the Reformation. She had to be. She was Anne Boleyn's daughter. And that meant that her destiny was to lead a Reformation. Also because her sister's attempt to reverse the Reformation was not working terribly well. And it had been sullied by burning people at the stake in a way which was quite old-fashioned by the 1550s and 60s. So Elizabeth knew the direction she had to go to, but she didn't want to go right down the way towards John Calvin. What she did actually was fossilize the untidy end of Edward VI's Reformation. Just take what had happened, subtract one or two bits, and then make that her religious settlement. It's sort of much more like Lutheranism than Scotland's Reformation, for instance. And that's what she hung on to. And no one else could understand what she was doing. Most Protestants at the time thought, well, it'll change. It'll go on changing like all the other Reformations. But no, it didn't. And because she's sitting on the throne for 45 years, by that time, by the end of her reign, people had sort of accepted it. They'd know nothing else if they were middle-aged or younger. So it's Elizabeth's peculiar achievement to create a church which was slightly less reformed than other reformed churches. So she's really is the mother of the Church of England, much more than Henry VIII is its father.
Well, I guess that we've kind of veered from Thomas Cromwell, but you know so much about the Tudors. But when you look at the Tudor monarchs, which one did you enjoy looking at the most and studying? Enjoy.
Well,
maybe that might not be the right word.
The one I respect most is Elizabeth, because she knows about limits. The one who's fascinating is the boy Edward and the things which happened so rapidly under his reign. And so that's the center of my research over the years. Henry VIII, well, the more you know about him, the more you dislike him.
Yeah.
Henry VII is really interesting. He seemed so dull when I studied him as an undergraduate, but that's because the books about him were dull.
Oh.
And then I found one book which absolutely electrified me about his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, by Michael Jones and Malcolm Underwood. And suddenly I realized how interesting he was. But I also realized why Henry VIII was like he was. This family are painfully aware of how fragile their claim to the throne is, and the fact that they must actually kill anyone else who has a better claim. And that was partly the work of Thomas Cromwell, that he inherited this task of eliminating people with a better claim to the throne. Didn't entirely succeed, but by the mid-Tudor period, there are not many left.
No, there really aren't. It's funny that you said that about Henry VII, because he has always been the one to me that's the least interesting. And I hate to say that because clearly he is the father of the dynasty. I wish there was something about him that really pulled me in and wanted me to research him more. Elizabeth of York, she's interesting to me. She isn't, without her, what would his claim, would it have been much weaker than?
Would have been weaker, but actually his claim is God. The claim is winning the Battle of Bosworth, and that's what the Act of Parliament said, recognising him as king. His reign was actually dated from the day before the Battle of Bosworth.
Yes.
But the Act of Parliament does not refer to any of the dynastic claims that he could have made because they're all pathetically weak.
Yeah.
It says that he is on the throne to the pleasure of Almighty God. Won the battle.
Yeah.
And that makes sense at the time. That's how God works. But it does leave people with a better genealogical claim still in the game. And if you want to be interested in the reign, I think that's one of the things to remember, that he's always conscious of the other people. And the fact that actually, when he came to the throne in 1485, he hardly knew England. He had been a child in England. After that, he'd been in France or Brittany. And it must have been a bit like walking into a party where you don't know anybody, don't know their faces. And so that his reign is about compensating for that and learning how to be a king. And it took time. Not that good at it to start with.
Well, he wasn't really raised to do that.
Well, exactly. He just doesn't know how you do a king thing. He'd watched the King of France a bit, so he had begun to pick up a picture, and he's a quick learner. But there are all sorts of mistakes to start with.
Did he speak with a different accent?
I guess so. But what could that have been?
Right.
We think of him as a Welshman, but really he wasn't. He flattered the Welsh by saying, well, I'm Welsh, you know. But the English wouldn't have bought that. I suspect, he probably had a French accent, whatever that might have been, speaking English. And then perhaps modified it as he got to London, bit by bit.
Right. Out of necessity, right?
Yes.
Well, I enjoy speaking with you so much, and I understand that you're working on a new project.
Completely different. It's about sex, and it's a history of sex and Christianity throughout all Christian history, all over the place. It's done. It's out in September 2024. And it has been huge fun doing something completely different to Thomas Cromwell.
Yeah, what? I was raised in the Catholic Church, and so this topic is very intriguing to me because I've never understood the limits that are put on Catholic priests. Yeah. And so this topic, wow.
Read all about it from fall 2024.
I will definitely promote that. And anybody who's listening right now or watching right now, we'll be sure to include some links to anything that you have, all of your books here. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me today here at Cadhay House.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Wonderful.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.